All right, so this last component of the course has been involved with government policy. And so we've worked our way through a series of different types of government interventions in the marketplace, starting with a simple thing like a tax on a product, a subsidy on a product, and then we moved to a country opening up to trade, putting a tax on imported goods. We talked about a price ceiling, we talked about a price floor, and we talked about price supports. So these are all some basic policies that governments can and do implement from time to time. Many times they're necessary, like with taxes. Taxes have to be collected in order to provide for government services and so forth. So we've been working our way through a description of the effects of different types of government policies. But starting last lecture and continuing to the end of the course, we're taking a slight diversion to incorporate what are called market imperfections. And a market imperfection is a deviation away from the standard assumptions of perfect competition. And one of the reasons this is very, very important is because it's important to recognize that the model of economics that we most primarily use to understand the way in which markets work, the basic model in neoclassical economics, it's called, is a model of perfect competition. And one thing that is true about that model is that it is simplified to an inordinate degree almost too much it's simplified. And as a result of that, when we work our way through and assess the effects of different types of government interventions in the presence or in the context of a perfectly competitive market economy, we've discovered that basically anything the government does makes things worse. It reduces economic efficiency, meaning that the total amount of happiness that's spread out across the population and the economy is diminished somewhat as a result of any sort of government intervention. So put a tax in place, the economy is worse. Put a subsidy in place, the economy is worse. Put a price ceiling in place, the economy is worse. Again, all in the context of a perfectly competitive market assumptions. But those perfect competition assumptions are not 100% valid. They're not true all of the time. And there's lots of situations and times when markets deviate away from those standard assumptions of perfect competition. All right, and when we do that, and when we want to introduce and talk about issues like that, we've now entered into this realm of market imperfections. All right, and there's a whole bunch of different types of imperfections that we study and we can assess and evaluate. Okay, the first one of those is public goods, and that's what we talked about primarily last time in class. A public good is a product that is non-excludable and non-rival in consumption, and because of those features of the good itself, it makes it difficult for a private market to supply or produce at an optimal level. So it's quite likely that if public goods were provided for by private firms, that these public goods would be undersupplied, that we wouldn't get quite as much of the product as would be socially optimal or best for the economy overall. All right, and so I'm going to come back and talk about this and summarize the result that we got here. But I just want to highlight at first that this is one of the types of market imperfections that we can introduce into our models and have. Second type of imperfection is something called a common resource, which is our primary focus of today's lecture. And this is a product which it's excludable in consumption, but it's non-rival. All right, and I'll explain what that means and what sort of goods have that particular characteristic in a minute. But it's a second type of market imperfection. And it's going to also, again, what we're discovering with public goods and then with common resources, and then we will see later on with negative externalities and other things, that government actually can step in and do some good. It can actually improve the market outcome relative to what would happen if we just left things alone. All right, and so introducing market imperfections like public goods, common resources, externality effects, and we're going to talk about the effects of pollution, a little bit about climate change, things of that sort. We're going to talk about government interventions to try to promote certain good outcomes because of the presence of so-called positive externality effects. But we've also talked about imperfections in markets earlier when we talked about monopolies and oligopoly behavior in markets, when we talked about the possibility of deception and the presence of imperfect information. Imperfect information is another type of market imperfection because our perfectly competitive market assumes that away. It says, let's suppose everybody has all of the information they need in order to make the appropriate decisions in the marketplace. When that's not true, we have a market imperfection. When we have a market imperfection, the same policies that we've just analyzed, taxes, subsidies, what have you, these may not generate the same negative overall outcomes that we saw when we analyzed them in the presence of perfect competition. All right, so in a larger sense, then introducing market imperfections, which is a realistic feature of the real world, is also opening up the door for a government, for the government to do something which is economically valid and economically useful. Okay, and so that's our point and purpose of these last several lectures. It's going to give us the economic argument for government and why government can actually be a useful force. But at the same time as we're talking about government as a useful force, we have to keep in mind that government can also act in a malicious way. And so we have to be a little bit careful about jumping to generalized conclusions, because oftentimes it's going to depend on the circumstances and the specifics of the situation involved. Okay, so we're going to get at that and analyze that a little bit more as we go forward. Okay, so let me start with the first highlight here on this particular slide, which says, what is the purpose of a democratic government? And one of the standard arguments that most people will accept is that governments are there to provide public goods. Now again, public goods, as analyzed last time in class, last Monday, is a good that has the features of being non-rival and non-excludable in consumption. That means once you provide it, everybody can use it simultaneously. And also it's very difficult, not always impossible, but difficult to provide the service to one person while excluding another person from getting the benefits at the same time. And the characteristics, the goods that have those features are listed right here and are often talked about as being the sort of primary public goods that governments are there to provide for. So an internal police force to maintain internal order. And this is something because if we have society that is following the rules of the game, which means, you know, don't deceive each other, don't be violent towards each other, don't hurt each other, don't steal from each other. All of these things are necessary sort of ethical behavioral modes which help markets work more effectively. Markets will work more efficiently, will get more happiness spread out to more people if people follow these ethical principles. One way in which we force that or get people to induce them to behave in that particular way is by having something like an internal police force that maintains internal order. But also, we have to maintain our national defense against foreign enemies that might be tempted to invade the country, take over our system, eliminate the freedoms that we have, and so forth and so on. National security or national defense also has these characteristics of public goods, non-excludability, non-rivalry. And so it makes some sense to be provided for by a government. That government can eliminate the free rider problem associated with the non-excludability aspect and can actually provide this particular product, resource, service to the population much more effectively than could be done independently. And we actually worked our way through an example of that last time in class, where we very simply considered building a wall and how individuals could build a wall for their own farms, but it's really beneficial if you could protect everybody simultaneously. And it can make sense to have a government step in to provide that particular public good to the population. A judicial system, critically important again to maintain this system of contracts, to make sure that contracts are enforceable, to make sure that people do not commit violence against each other, they don't steal from each other, and so forth and so on. But we have to have a system that can make evaluations about who's guilty of such infractions and what to do about individuals who are found guilty of such things. All right, so we have a judicial system, which again is provided for generally by government, and there's reasons why this whole judicial system actually serves as a public good. It provides for the general welfare of the population, and it's best suited for these things to be provided for by government. Roads and parks, another example of public goods. Public parks available to anybody. You can walk in and use the park to your own desire and your own pleasure without it diminishing the use of other people using the park at the same time. Again, this is subject to non-congestion, that the park doesn't get overly crowded. Same thing is true with roads. Roads extend throughout the country, and quite honestly, it always amazes me how far and wide you can go on a paved road that's often in perfect condition, and it provides an enormous amount of freedoms and benefits and greases the wheels of production and helps the economy work and function much, much more effectively because the roads are there and because we have parks to enjoy and things of that sort. So again, these are other types of public goods that most people find unobjectionable for the government to be providing for. And then again, enforcement of laws, which is just reiteration of the judicial system and the internal police and so forth. All of that is a necessary provision of a public good that can rightfully be claimed as being the primary role, primary purpose of a government. Okay, so that's kind of, and I will often say, for those who are very free market oriented, they'll often talk about a minimal government. Like, very few people actually, there's a few, but very few people actually argue for no government at all, that we should have complete anarchy and should just let people interact with each other as they see fit. Most people who are staunch free market advocates will nevertheless argue that a minimal government is still necessary. And when you ask, or if you inquire further, well, what does minimal government require? What does it consist of? Right here, this list of things, this provision of standard public goods is what most people will have in mind as being the true role of government. And perhaps the most important being this second one here, which is an army to protect against foreign threats. That we need to provide for the national defense and security, and that can best be accomplished by a federal government rather than state governments, and certainly rather than by individuals themselves. Okay, so a lot of discussion here just to highlight that this is the primary role of government, perhaps, in an economy. Now, what's the right amount of government? And here, I just want to emphasize a couple of points. One is that the provision of public goods can be adequately provided for by the government, but it's not necessarily going to be true. If there's too little government, for example, public goods might not be sufficiently supplied, just like a private market. If there's too much government, though, you can go to the other extreme, and you have the potential for tyranny. You've got the potential for exploitation by government officials over the populace. You can lose individual freedoms and so forth. To give you a good example of this, not quite to the extent of tyranny, but think about government providing for the national security or defense. Lots of individuals will argue over whether we spend too much money or too little money on the national security or national defense. I mean, I think right now in the United States, last I remember from the US budget is that we're spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $800 billion per year that goes to the Defense Department and provides for the national security. Okay, now, $800 billion, is that the right amount? Some will argue, no, we're spending way too much on military preparedness and we should taper that back to $600 billion or $500 or even $300 billion. While others look at that same issue and say, no, we're not protecting the economy or the society enough. We need to spend even more in the military. And it's quite possible for government to, in providing for a public good, to kind of go too far, to collect too much in taxes, to provide over security, to spend too much money. And for those individuals who are then receiving the government benefits, like the Defense Department, that they could sort of exploit the population to some degree by promoting their own interests and promoting the military over and above what's absolutely necessary to protect the country from foreign threats. All right, so it is important to recognize that while government can provide for the appropriate level of a public good, can provide doesn't mean that it will provide the appropriate amount. It's possible to go too little, it's possible to go too far, and it's an important debate then about what is the right level of government. How much defense spending should we have? Not whether we should have it at all, but what is the right level of government is something that is open to debate and subject to differing opinions. Last point here. We have to keep in mind, and this is a really important aspect, is to go back to the Mansur-Olson arguments that we talked about a couple of weeks ago or so. In that, special interests often have an outsized role in terms of influencing the decisions of a democratically elected government. And so we have to ask questions a lot. When government is going to provide for something, we have to be asking the question, is the government providing for the general interests, or are they acting in the special interests of lobby groups who are influencing the decisions that governments are making? And this becomes a really important aspect of, I would say, any conversation that you have or argument you have about should the government do this or should they not? We have to ask, how is the government going to make the decision about what to do? So I'll give you a quick example. So when Obamacare was first being considered by the Obama administration in the early parts of his first term, you know, you could argue, okay, we need to fix the healthcare system. We need to make it more amenable. We have to get more people covered. How are we going to do that? Well, one way to do that is to sit down with kind of experts and figure out how to figure out what the best system is to put into place and then put it into place. The second way to do it, which is kind of how this Obamacare came about, is more to say, well, let's open it up to the general public and get all of their feedback, and then we'll kind of do what the public wants. Well, once you do that, you're setting up a system where the special interests are the ones who have money to spend, the ones who are most affected by the decisions, which are going to be, you know, insurance companies, for example. It's going to be their concerns that are going to be most likely to make their way into legislation, rather than the general interests, the dispersed losses that might occur to the average consumer are going to be less accounted for potentially. Not completely ignored, but less accounted for than the special interests. And so whenever you say or make an argument, government should do X, I think it's very important to say, how is government going to actually make the decision of what to do, and who are they going to listen to? Do they listen to everyone equally, or are they going to listen more to the wealthy? Are they going to promote monopoly power amongst certain firms and special interests, or are they going to work against monopoly power and work in the interests of consumers? So this is an extremely valid and important point that's subject to, that should be a part of our debate about what is the role of government and how big should government be.